Throughout history, music has been an incredibly powerful tool. There is no better example of this than the life and legacy of Dmitri Shostakovich. Despite constant fears of the state, and even personal rebukes from Stalin himself, Shostakovich continued to fight oppression through his music. These acts of resistance, though small, were enough to make an impact. After Stalin's death, Shostakovich continued to resist censorship, and during de-Stalinization, even formed committees to educate about and attempt to prevent the atrocities that occurred under Stalin from happening again. Shostakovich was born into a musical family in St. Petersburg, 1906, in Tsarist Russia. His mother was a pianist, and his father was a singer. Throughout his life, St. Petersburg would remain relevant, appearing in his music, and would change names 3 times before his death in 1975. Shostakovich was a generational talent, and the child prodigy would enter the Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, Conservatory at age 13, studying piano and composition. As a teenager, Shostakovich would live through and witness World War I, the Russian Revolution, and the formation of the Soviet Union. And when he graduated in 1925, Petrograd was once again renamed, this time to Leningrad. Shostakovich graduated from the conservatory with his first symphony, which would immediately thrust him onto the international stage. The 19-year-old's composition was incredibly popular around the world and was the first Soviet composition to find its way into the regular repertoires of Western orchestras. As a result, he also received attention from Soviet leadership, and eventually, in 1927, he received his first state commission to produce a symphony honoring the revolution. His second symphony, with its industrial vibes and even the inclusion of a factory whistle, as heard in the excerpt, was essentially a propaganda piece. While it was critically acclaimed, Shostakovich was unhappy with the finished product and considered it unsatisfactory. As a young composer, Shostakovich was also heavily involved in the composition of operas and ballets, producing 3 ballets and 2 operas. One of his operas was Lady Macbeth of the District of Mtsensk, a piece that had an exceedingly dark storyline and was composed in 1936. Coincidentally, this was the year that Joseph Stalin commenced his first purge, killing and imprisoning tens of thousands of the people that he considered to be enemies or undecided. Lady Macbeth immediately garnered mixed reviews. Under Stalin, the ideologically prescribed style was socialist realism, a form that was supposed to be relevant to the workers and to positively reflect on the Soviet Union. Macbeth, with concepts like murder and suicide, was clearly different from the expected norm. Despite this, the opera was incredibly popular with audiences and continued to run. However, 2 years after the opera's premiere, Stalin himself, along with several other high-ranking Soviet officials, attended a performance of Lady Macbeth at the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow, with Shostakovich also being in attendance. During the performance, Shostakovich witnessed Stalin's visible discomfort, and when Shostakovich emerged on stage at the end of the opera, as white as a sheet, he saw that Stalin had already left. 2 days later, the official state newspaper, Pravda, which translates to truth, savagely rebuked the opera, describing it as muddle instead of music. Historians believe Stalin himself was involved in the creation of this revue and the subsequent shutdown of Shostakovich's opera. Shostakovich was immediately thrust into a precarious situation, and he personally knew the danger he was in. Earlier, in 1937, Shostakovich's brother-in-law had been arrested as a member of a terrorist organization, and his sister and mother-in-law had been deported as well. He himself was summoned for interrogation, but managed to escape due to his interrogator being arrested. The terrified composer even slept in his stairwell and kept a bag packed, waiting to spare his family from experiencing the arrest that in his eyes was imminent. With the threat of arrest or worse looming over him, Shostakovich rushed out his Fifth Symphony, which in his program notes was described as a Soviet artist's response to just criticism. This masterpiece proved that Shostakovich was too valuable a resource to waste to the Soviet government, and he was reinstated as an official composer. But it also had a sense of resistance to it, showing that Shostakovich had not yet been completely cowed. The Nazi invasion of the USSR immediately changed Shostakovich's life. While he clearly wasn't a model Soviet, he was still a patriot, and immediately volunteered for the Red Army. In a letter to a friend, he wrote, "I am going to defend my country and am prepared, sparing neither life nor strength, to carry out any mission I am assigned." However, he was rejected due to poor eyesight and joined the Leningrad Fire Brigade instead. Because he was a celebrity, however, he was kept out of harm and mostly used as a propaganda tool, with photos of the composer in his fireman's uniform circulating around the world. His time in Leningrad was more significantly spent composing his Seventh Symphony, which would represent the people of Leningrad in their struggle. War, Shostakovich later said, was all around us. "I had to be together with the people. I wanted to create the image of our embattled country, to engrave it in music." As the Germans advanced, Shostakovich made the decision to stay in the city, even while all of his colleagues at the conservatory evacuated. Shostakovich witnessed firsthand the brutal siege of Leningrad, where up to 2 million people died, many due to starvation. Despite the brutal air raids and conditions, Shostakovich stayed for a time and continued to work on his symphony, but eventually he was flown out to Moscow, which he was also forced to leave when the Germans approached. When his Seventh Symphony finally premiered, it was a resounding success with both the public and the Soviet government. An official Pravda review, the very gazette that had once denounced him, stated, "Hitler did not scare Shostakovich. Shostakovich is a Russian man, and that means an angry man, and if you get him really angry, he is capable of fantastic feats." However, there is much more to this piece than meets the eye. While the official reason for this symphony's composition was the German invasion, a close friend of the composer later confirmed that he had begun its conception a year earlier and had other enemies of humanity, not just Hitler, in mind when composing it. A significant portion of the first movement is now colloquially known as Stalin's March, and is thought to have represented both Soviet tyranny and that of the Nazis. The section starts with a military drumbeat that remains prevalent throughout the rest of the piece. An upbeat, surprisingly happy melody plays, repeating. However, as the piece progresses, an unsettling undertone seems to pervade the music, while the melody continues to repeat itself over and over again. This continues, with the brass being added in and the drumline crescendoing. The menacing undertone builds, and eventually, the strings and brass produce runs that mimic air raid sirens and the sounds of war. Eventually, the upbeat melody, which is repeated since the start of the piece, is replaced by an aggressive brass one, almost like a facade being wiped away. Although not known at the time, Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony was a condemnation of all the tyranny and oppression he had experienced in Leningrad, not just that of the Nazis. Another example of such subtle resistance to oppression under Stalin was Shostakovich's Ninth Symphony. The symphony was commissioned in 1945 after the USSR's victory over Nazi Germany, and was supposed to be a grandiose work, celebrating the righteous victory of the Soviet Union. Instead, Shostakovich produced a light and whimsical piece, which sounded almost sarcastic, and he described as, "Musicians will like to play it, and critics will delight at blasting it." Stalin took this as a personal insult, and not too long later, in 1948, Shostakovich, in addition to many other Soviet composers, was denounced for composing formalist music, and much of his music was banned. He was declared an enemy of the people, fired from his teaching job, and would once again fear arrest. His situation would not get better until 1953, the year of Stalin's death. Coincidentally, Prokofiev, another famous Russian composer of the era, died on the same day as Stalin, with a brain hemorrhage being the cause of death for both. Shostakovich attended the late composer's funeral and remarked on his admiration for the man. However, Shostakovich would work his way out of the situation, in part due to the death of Stalin, which saw the limitations that the state had put on him ease. Though de-Stalinization gave Shostakovich much more freedom than before, he was eventually coerced into joining the Communist Party, in part due to the promise of a position as the chairman of the RSFSR, a type of composers group or union. This choice has been interpreted differently by many. Some consider it an act of cowardice, while others see it as a way for Shostakovich to stand in solidarity with other composers and to attempt to prevent censure of the same scale that occurred under Stalin's regime. Immediately after joining the party, Shostakovich's mental health declined sharply, and he was deeply unhappy with his position. He would visit the war-torn city of Dresden, where he would compose his 8th string quartet in just 3 days. The 8th string quartet is often thought to be of a personal nature, giving listeners a glimpse into Shostakovich himself. This is partly because of the frequent musical quotations from his previous repertoire and the DSCH motif, which he used throughout the piece. The DSCH motif was the result of transcribing Shostakovich's initials into German music notation, and he used this motif in many of his pieces. The Eighth Quartet begins with this motif. The piece then follows with a theme of his First Symphony, the piece that brought him fame, and includes the theme of his Fifth Symphony, the piece that restored him as a composer from Soviet scrutiny. The peaceful but somber atmosphere of the first movement is shattered by the second, which is violent and fast. At its climax, Shostakovich's haunting Jewish theme from his piano trio plays, possibly in reference to the Holocaust, but also to the anti-Semitism that was a mark of Stalin's regime. Throughout his musical career, Shostakovich's solidarity with the Jewish people in a regime that was marked by anti-Semitism was truly impressive, and his commitment to this, even going so far as to write a letter to Stalin to vouch for the innocence of one of his Jewish colleagues, was notable. The third movement starts off with chords that play in a knocking pattern, representing the Soviet government that, at many points throughout his life, seemed to be about to get rid of him at any moment. After the knocking theme, the Dies Irae theme plays, a somber piece usually played only at funerals. Not coincidentally, these are the same notes as Shostakovich's own DSCH theme, simply arranged in a different order. Finally, at the end of Shostakovich's quartet, Dies Irae plays again and warps into his own DSCH sequence, finishing the piece. It seems like this quartet is telling us the story of Shostakovich's own life, complete with his signature and excerpts from his own pieces. However, when considering Shostakovich's mental situation when he wrote this quartet, the general feeling of tragedy and profound wrongness at some parts of this piece, and his constant personal signature all provide evidence, along with other correspondence, that Shostakovich's Eighth Quartet was intended to be a suicide note, with the composer including other elements, such as the warped folk song, to resist the regime that had oppressed him all his life one last time. Shostakovich, however, would not take his own life, and though he would continue to struggle with his mental health, he would also continue to compose. Shostakovich's 11th Symphony is perhaps one of the most incredible examples of telling a story and sending a message through music. It is subtitled The Year 1905 in reference to Bloody Sunday, an event that occurred during the tail end of Tsar Nicholas II's reign. The year is 1905, and it is a frigid winter in St. Petersburg. A crowd of thousands of workers, women, children, and the elderly march toward the Tsar's palace. At their head, a procession led by an Orthodox priest leads the cold and hungry crowd in songs. Many in the crowd are devoutly Orthodox and clutch icons. They sing religious hymns and God Bless the Tsar, intending to provide a petition to Nicholas II, requesting better work conditions and food. At this point in the symphony, you can hear the hymns waving up from the crowd. The peaceful gathering continues to sing and wait, but there is no response from the Tsar. However, the palace guard is supplemented as more and more soldiers arrive. Eventually, there will be 10,000 soldiers with the mission of controlling the protesters and maintaining order. But things will soon go from bad to worse for the protesters. Soon, the soldiers begin to surround and corral the crowds, and eventually resort to force. The crowds begin to panic, and eventually, shots are fired. This is clearly signified by a snare drum, which rattles like an automatic rifle. The panic intensifies, and the strings, representing the protesters, play a rapid and fearful melody as the brass plays louder and louder and begins to overwhelm the strings. As the panic reaches a climax, the snare returns with a military beat, and the melody changes to a murderous and emotional dirge, with the timpani in the background now providing even more firepower. By the end of the day, hundreds will die, with many more injured or arrested. Their demands have gone unheard, and the worst part is that the Tsar wasn't even there. The final movement of the symphony begins with a somber section in memoriam of those who perished on Bloody Sunday. However, the winds will soon begin to play a frantic melody as alarm drums go off and a bugle is heard. It should come as no surprise that this movement is titled tocsin, a type of bell used for alarms. After the events of Bloody Sunday, the revolution of 1905 would occur, and the Tsar would be deposed. The message of this movement is clear. Tyranny, in any form, must be fought against. Alarm bells blare out and a triumphant but aggressive brass melody plays. Shostakovich, through his music and this symphony in particular, shows us his true sentiments. His work gives us an unfiltered view of tyranny and brutality, but it also seems to tell us how to confront it, head-on and unflinching.